The Middle Ages, an era built not only of stone and hymns, but of blood and fear. As the first light of dawn crawled across the cobblestones of a medieval square, the mist parted to reveal a wooden scaffold, old, stained, and waiting. A crowd was already gathering. Men with tankards of ale, women clutching loaves of bread, and children perched on their fathers' shoulders. Their breaths formed clouds in the cold air. Their murmurs rose like prayer, not for mercy, but for spectacle. For centuries before prisons, human rights, or due process existed, justice was not delivered in silence. It was performed, loudly, publicly, before the eyes of all. In the 13th to 17th centuries, Europe was a theater of punishment. The square was the stage, the condemned its unwilling actors, and the people, eager, expectant, were the audience. Every sentence was a ritual, every death a lesson. The church bells rang not to mourn, but to summon. From miles away, peasants left their fields to witness the king's justice unfold. They called it law, they called it order, but beneath the chants and laughter there lingered something darker, fascination, even delight at the sight of suffering. For in those centuries, the law was written not in ink, but in blood. The gallows rose like skeletons against the morning sky. Beneath them, men and women waited for judgment, their crimes written on scraps of parchment, their names already half forgotten. Around them, hawkers sold roasted nuts and wine. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and expectation. When the guards arrived, the crowd surged forward. Children screamed in excitement. Mothers lifted them higher. "Watch," they whispered. "This is justice." But what they watched was terror. The condemned were dragged through the mud, tied, branded, humiliated. Some prayed, some cursed, some trembled so hard they could barely stand. And when the executioner appeared, masked, cloaked, his axe glinting, a hush fell. It was the silence before thunder, before the world turned red. Justice in the Middle Ages was not about redemption. It was about control. The law was the king's will, and the king's will was absolute. To defy it was to defy God himself. Public executions were the beating heart of authority. They reminded every citizen that power did not whisper, it screamed. Every swing of the axe, every creak of the rope, every drop of blood that touched the soil became part of the kingdom's order. And yet, there was something disturbingly human in the crowd's gaze. They did not turn away. They leaned closer. Some wept, not for pity, but for awe. Others cheered as the blade rose, hungry for that single moment when death became entertainment. What had begun as divine justice had become a ritual of fear. The scaffold was an altar, the condemned a sacrifice, and over it all the voice of the church and the crown declared, "This is righteousness, this is peace." But beneath the surface, everyone knew it was terror that kept the peace. As centuries passed, the methods changed, but the essence remained. Hanging, beheading, burning, quartering, each was a language through which power spoke. Each execution told a story, not of guilt or innocence, but of authority, reminding its subjects who truly ruled. The people believed they were watching justice, but what they were truly witnessing was themselves. Their fascination with pain, their hunger for spectacle, their need to see blood, to believe in order. Because to them, law was not an idea, it was a sight, a sound, a scream that echoed through the square and into the memory of a generation. In that age, children learned early, mercy was weakness, punishment was divine. And so they clapped, they laughed, they stared, and the line between justice and cruelty disappeared. As the sun reached its peak, the executioner raised his axe high. The crowd fell silent. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then, steel met flesh. A roar erupted. Some shouted, "Glory to the king!" Others simply smiled, satisfied. Justice had been done. But as the blood seeped into the earth, no one questioned what it truly meant. Was this law or vengeance? Faith or fear? The answer, perhaps, lay in the faces of those who watched. Because in the Middle Ages, law was not blind. It had eyes, cold, unflinching, and they belonged to the crowd.
Hanging, a punishment so deceptively simple, yet so unspeakably cruel. In the shadow of medieval justice, few deaths were as public or as slow. The condemned would be led through the muddy streets, their necks encircled with coarse rope, their faces pale with the knowledge that every step brought them closer to suffocation. Bells tolled in the distance, not to mourn, but to announce. The king's law was about to speak. At the center of the square stood the gallows, rough-hewn beams stained with years of suffering. Beneath them, the trapdoor waited like an open mouth. The crowd gathered, buzzing with restless anticipation. Mothers lifted their children, eager to show them what justice looked like. Merchants sold sweetmeats and cider. Priests whispered prayers. Executioners checked the knots with hands as steady as stone. It was said that the condemned man's final walk was not the longest road, but the heaviest silence. When the rope was placed around his neck, there was no mercy in the eyes of the crowd, only curiosity. Would he die quickly or dance for them first? Because in the Middle Ages, hanging was rarely clean. The drop was not meant to break the neck immediately. It was designed to let the body twist, jerk, and struggle in the air, an agony that could last minutes. Witnesses often described the same sight: a man kicking violently, eyes bulging, tongue protruding as his lungs collapsed and his windpipe crushed slowly under his own weight. The sound, a wet, choking gasp, like water boiling, echoed through the square. Some fainted, some prayed, but most cheered. For them, this was not just punishment, it was proof. Proof that order existed, that sin was being purged, that the king's justice was alive and watching. The body convulsed, the rope creaked, and then stillness. A ragged silence swept the crowd. When the executioner finally cut the body down, it was often limp, purple, and wet with blood and fear. The priest would mutter his blessing, and the crowd would move on, ready for the next spectacle. Yet not all were given the noose. For the nobility, those born under banners and coats of arms, a different fate awaited: beheading. They called it an honorable death, quick and clean, the privilege of the powerful. But the blade was not always merciful. The condemned would kneel upon straw, their hands bound, their neck placed upon a wooden block, darkened by the stains of countless others. A hush would fall as the executioner, often hooded, raised his axe high. If his arm was strong and his aim true, the head would fall in a single stroke. If not, the horror lingered. There were stories, whispered among townsfolk, recorded by trembling scribes, of botched executions that turned ritual to nightmare. In one, the executioner's first swing missed the neck, striking the shoulder instead. The crowd gasped. The victim screamed. The second blow cracked bone but did not sever. The third, at last, finished the deed, and the people cheered as though justice had triumphed. But it had not been justice. It had been performance. The English were masters of this theater. From the 14th to the 17th century, hanging and beheading became not just punishment, but rituals of state. Each execution carried a message. The king is law, and whoever stands against him ceases to be human. In London, the Tower Hill and Tyburn gallows became infamous landmarks. The condemned were paraded through the streets, jeered by crowds, spat upon, mocked. Their last words were drowned by laughter. The noose and the axe were not merely tools, they were symbols, woven into the identity of the nation. To be hanged or beheaded was not just to die, it was to be erased, to serve as a warning carved into the collective memory of the people. For traitors, the message was even clearer. Their bodies were displayed, heads impaled on spikes atop London Bridge, eyes pecked by crows, mouths frozen in eternal screams. Each one was a monument to fear, each one whispering the same truth to passers-by. This is what happens when you defy the crown. And yet, among the silence of those bloodied streets, something deeper stirred. A question, unspoken but haunting. Was this law or vengeance? Perhaps both, because for rulers, fear was the strongest form of loyalty, and for the people, witnessing pain was a kind of reassurance that the world still had order, that a face and it was dying before them. As centuries passed, executioners became celebrities in their own right, masters of precision and spectacle. Some took pride in the clean stroke, the perfect knot. Others relished the attention, knowing that for a few minutes they held the power of both life and death. But behind every gallows and chopping block lay the same truth. The law of the Middle Ages was never about justice, it was about obedience. The king's word was absolute. The rope and the blade were his punctuation marks, and each drop of blood that stained the wood beneath them spelled out the same decree: defy me, and you will hang. By the time the crows descended upon the remains, the crowd had already dispersed. The laughter faded, the market reopened, children played again where men had just died. The executioner wiped his blade clean, the priest closed his book, and the city returned to its rhythm, as though nothing had happened. But in the silence of night, when the wind swept across the empty square, the echoes remained. The creak of the rope, the dull thud of the axe, and the whisper that never truly left England's history. On this land, the king's law rules all, and no man's neck is too noble to break beneath it.
But for the crime of treason, hanging or beheading was far too merciful. By the 14th century, England had perfected something far darker, a ritual so elaborate, so horrifying, it blurred the line between justice and spectacle. They called it hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was not merely a sentence, it was a statement, a message from the throne itself. To defy the king is to defy God. The condemned was first dragged through the muddy streets, tied to the tail of a horse. The crowd gathered, jeering, throwing filth and rotten fruit. This humiliation was deliberate, the beginning of erasure. The man was no longer a citizen, no longer a soldier, no longer human. He was a warning in motion. When the cart reached the scaffold, the rope awaited.
that same rough hemp that had silenced countless throats before. The executioner fixed it around the prisoner's neck, the crowd fell into an expectant hush, and then the trap gave way. The man hung, struggling between life and death, long enough for the onlookers to see his body twitch, long enough for the priests to finish their prayers. But before the final breath escaped, he was cut down. He was not meant to die yet. Death, in this theater, was not the conclusion, it was the performance itself. As the crowd pressed forward, the executioner took a knife, small, sharp, and cruelly deliberate. The condemned, still conscious, was stripped naked and stretched upon a wooden block. Then came the cut, deep and slow. His belly opened like a wound in the earth. Witnesses said the air filled with the smell of blood and bile. Some turned away. Others leaned closer. The executioner reached inside, hands slick with crimson, and pulled out the man's intestines, one by one, lifting them high for the crowd to see, proof that justice had depth as well as spectacle. The heart and liver were cut free and tossed into a small fire beside the scaffold, hissing and crackling in the flames. The condemned would often still be alive, aware, screaming, gasping, and when the smoke from his burning organs reached his nose, it was said the body shuddered, as if the soul itself resisted leaving. Then came the final act. The body was laid out, limbs stretched apart and cleaved into 4 pieces, the arms and legs severed with heavy axes. Each fragment was salted to preserve it, then packed into baskets and sent across the kingdom, displayed at city gates, bridges, and marketplaces. The head, blackened with tar, was set upon a spike on London Bridge, a grim crown for the empire of fear. For the English monarchy, this was not just punishment, it was propaganda carved in flesh. Each dismembered piece was a message to every subject. The body of the traitor may die, but his lesson will live in 1,000 terrified hearts. And among those names that bled into legend, one stands above all: William Wallace. The Scottish knight who dared to defy King Edward I, the man who led a rebellion against the English crown, who fought not for glory, but for freedom. Captured in 1305, Wallace was brought to London in chains. The crowds jeered as he was dragged through the streets, the great rebeller reduced to a criminal, yet witnesses wrote that his face remained calm. He neither begged nor wept. When offered the chance to plead for mercy, he refused. At Smithfield Market, beneath a gray English sky, the ceremony began. Wallace was hanged until near death, then cut down, still breathing. The executioner slit him open, drew out his bowels, and burned them before his eyes. And as the first blade pierced his chest, he did not curse his captors. He did not scream for salvation. He shouted one word that would outlive kings, empires, and centuries: freedom! Those who heard it swore that even the crowd fell silent, that for a moment, a brief, trembling heartbeat, they saw not a traitor, but a man who had chosen agony over submission. When the axes fell, England scattered his remains to the 4 corners of the realm: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, so that no part of him could ever rise again. But they were wrong. His death did not silence rebellion, it gave it a voice. For in the centuries that followed, poets and rebels would whisper his name like a prayer and a curse. William Wallace, torn apart, but never broken. The same fate awaited countless others, rebels, conspirators, men who dreamed of a different crown or creed. Among them was Guy Fawkes, the man who plotted to blow up the Houses of Parliament in 1605. Captured before his plan could ignite, Fawkes was tortured in the Tower, then sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. But before the rope could tighten, he leapt from the scaffold, breaking his neck instantly. Even in death, he denied his captors their spectacle. But the ritual lived on. For centuries, England's fields and squares bore witness to the choreography of cruelty. The perfect blend of fear, faith, and fascination. It was a theater performed not in whispers, but in cheers. The people gathered not to question, but to remember. This is how power survives. Because that was the secret at the heart of every execution. It was never about the condemned. It was about those who watched, about the invisible contract between ruler and ruled, written in the blood of the disobedient. Every hanging rope, every burning heart, every dismembered limb carried a message older than any law. Obey or suffer as they did. As centuries passed, the English would call themselves civilized. Their courts would adopt wigs and parchment. Their cities would gleam with progress. But the smell of old blood never quite faded. It lingered in the stories, in the cobblestones of Smithfield, in the dark waters beneath London Bridge. And when night fell, the heads of traitors, those long gone, seemed to whisper to the river below, "Freedom has a price, and England paid it in flesh." Across continental Europe, justice wore the mask of faith. If in England the law of kings ruled with the rope and the blade, then in Europe another law reigned, older, deeper, and far more terrifying: the law of God. It was not enough to obey kings. One had to obey heaven. And those who disobeyed were not merely criminals. They were heretics, enemies of the divine order. From the 13th to the 17th century, the continent was set ablaze, not only by war, but by conviction. The Inquisition, born in the shadowed halls of the church, became the guardian of truth. But its truth was fragile, and fragile truths defend themselves with fire. It began quietly, almost piously. Men in robes gathered in candlelit chambers, whispering of salvation and purity. They asked questions, soft at first, then sharper. Do you believe in God? Do you deny the Trinity? Do you think the earth moves? A single wrong word could light a pyre. Soon, the flames spread beyond the monasteries, reaching into towns and villages. Rumors of witchcraft, accusations of heresy, women who healed with herbs, men who studied the stars. Anyone whose knowledge reached further than Scripture was suspect, and thus began the age of fire. They said the fire purified, that smoke carried the soul upward, that through agony one could find redemption. But the truth was simpler and crueler. Fire did not purify, it erased. In the small squares of France, in the frozen valleys of Germany, in the plazas of Spain, pyres became pulpits. Executioners became preachers, and every burning body became a sermon. Crowds would gather at dawn, prayers on their lips, hope in their hearts, not for mercy, but for spectacle. The condemned were paraded through the streets in coarse robes painted with flames, a symbol of the hell awaiting them. Around their necks hung wooden signs bearing the words, "Heretic," "Witch," "Blasphemer." Some wept, some laughed, some sang hymns until the ropes tightened and the air filled with the smell of burning pitch. Among those who perished, one name would echo through centuries: Giordano Bruno. A philosopher, a dreamer, born in Nola, Italy, in the year 1548. He was a Dominican friar, sworn to faith, but his faith was larger than the church that claimed him. He looked at the stars and saw not divine perfection, but infinity. He spoke of countless worlds, of suns beyond the sun, of an endless universe where Earth was not the center, but merely one wandering spark. It was an idea too vast for his age, and for that idea, he was called a heretic. Bruno was arrested by the Inquisition in Venice in 1592. For 8 long years, he sat in a cold cell, interrogated, tortured, offered mercy if only he would recant, but he refused. When his judges pronounced the sentence, "death by fire," he answered calmly, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence with greater fear than I receive it."
On the morning of February 17, 1600, the streets of Rome were silent as the procession began. Bruno walked barefoot through the Campo dei Fiori, his hands bound, a wooden crucifix held before him. At the center of the square stood the stake, tall, dry, waiting. He was stripped, gagged, and chained. The crowd watched as the executioner placed the torch. The flames rose slowly, hungrily, wrapping his body in orange and gold. He did not scream. He did not beg. Witnesses said his eyes stayed open until the very end, fixed on the sky he had once called infinite. When the smoke cleared, only ashes remained. The church declared victory. But centuries later, the world would call him by another name: the martyr of reason. Giordano Bruno's fire was not the last. Across Europe, pyres continued to bloom, bright, terrible flowers fed by fear and faith. In Spain, the auto da fe, the act of faith, became a public festival. The condemned were marched in processions, banners high, hymns echoing through the streets. When the flames rose, nobles and peasants alike knelt to pray, as if to wash their own sins in the smoke of others. In Germany, entire villages burned with the cry of Hexe, witch. Old women, midwives, widows, anyone who stood apart, were bound and cast into the fire. Their only crime? Existing outside the order of men. In France, the same fire consumed Jeanne d'Arc, the Maid of Orleans, a 19-year-old peasant girl who claimed to hear the voice of God, who led armies, crowned kings, and defied both warlords and bishops. She was captured, branded a heretic, and burned alive in Rouen, 1431. Witnesses said she cried out, "Jesus," as the flames reached her face. The same church that condemned her later called her a saint. Fire was the judge, jury, and executioner of the Middle Ages. It was not only punishment, it was theater, theology, and control. It taught people to fear their own minds, to question nothing, to obey everything. And yet, within that darkness, something began to shift. By the 17th century, whispers of doubt began to stir among scholars, philosophers, and even priests. The telescope revealed heavens vaster than any holy book described. Science began to speak, quietly at first, then louder. And with each new truth discovered, another candle was lit against the great darkness of superstition. The same Europe that had burned its thinkers
now began to worship their ideas. The same Rome that silenced Bruno would one day place a statue of him on the very square where he died, facing the Vatican, unbowed. But the story of the fire did not end there, because the flame that once burned witches and philosophers never truly died. It merely changed shape. In the centuries to come, men would find new reasons to burn each other, not for heresy, but for ideology, not for God, but for nation, race, and power. And in every war, every genocide, every persecution, the same fire flickered, the ancient belief that suffering could cleanse, that death could purify. Giordano Bruno's ashes may have blown away with the Roman wind, but his final lesson remained, that no faith built on fear can ever be holy. The narrator's voice softens. They said fire was the light of truth, but truth does not need fire. Only lies do. The camera rises over the square of Campo dei Fiori, now filled with tourists and sunlight. At its center stands a statue, a man in a hooded cloak, face shadowed, eyes of bronze, staring toward eternity. Below his feet, a single line carved in stone. To Bruno, from the generation he foresaw. And the voice concludes, "The pyres have gone out, but their smoke still hangs over us, a reminder that every age has its heretics, and every heretic was just someone who dared to think."
Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The pyres turned to dust, the gallows to rust, the executioner's blade dulled and forgotten beneath the moss of time. But in the quiet corners of the world, in old squares and silent prisons, the echoes remain. Every stone that once drank blood remembers. Every iron hook, every cracked scaffold beam still hums with the faint vibration of screams long turned to wind. The Middle Ages are gone, but their shadow never truly left us. Because justice, no matter how civilized, was born from fear. Fear of chaos, fear of the unknown, fear of each other. The voice of the narrator deepens, slow, resonant, deliberate. We like to believe we've evolved, that law is now a shield, not a sword, that we no longer kill to prove what's right. But look closer. The arenas have changed, not disappeared. The crowds no longer gather in squares, they gather behind screens, their cheers replaced by comments, their stones by words sharper than steel. Public judgment still exists, only the platform has shifted. Every age finds its heretics, every society invents new pyres, and each time we tell ourselves it's for justice. In London, where people ate bread and drank ale while watching traitors die, now stand cafes and museums. Tourists walk the same cobblestones where heads once rolled, taking photographs, unaware that beneath their feet lie centuries of righteous blood. In Rome, the statue of Giordano Bruno watches from the Campo dei Fiori, the very place where he was burned. He faces the Vatican still, unmoving. The crowd no longer prays for his soul. They light candles, not torches. And yet, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint crackle of the old fires beneath the laughter of the modern square. The narrator's tone grows colder, quieter, almost like a whisper carved into stone. Every civilization buries its cruelty beneath the word order. Every empire calls its vengeance justice. The camera drifts through time, over the ruins of old gallows, over the broken wheels once used to crush bone, over the blackened wood of forgotten pyres. Rain falls. The world is older now, but no gentler. Because the law, even in its most enlightened form, was born from blood, and blood never forgets its origin. We have traded the rope for the gavel, the sword for the pen, but the impulse remains, to punish, to cleanse, to prove righteousness through the suffering of another. The law may now speak in measured words and printed codes, but beneath the ink you can still see the faint red stains of its first script, a script written not on parchment, but on flesh. Night falls over Europe. The camera glides above empty plazas, places that once roared with crowds, now silent. Only the wind moves, only memory breathes. A child chases a pigeon across the cobblestones, unaware that he runs across the stage of humanity's oldest performance, the theater of justice. The music swells, low strings, the pulse of a distant drum, and the voice returns, one last time, deep, echoing, ancient. The Middle Ages ended centuries ago, but the play goes on. The actors have changed, the script has not.